In the 15th century, peppercorns and cinnamon bark operated like high-value currency. They were the hard assets that fueled international power. For centuries, this wealth flowed through a single, massive artery, an ancient overland trade network connecting the production centers of India to the markets of Europe. This manuscript illustrates the system in action. Cargo changed hands multiple times, passed along by middlemen who took a cut as goods moved west. European economies built their entire trade structure around the end of this pipeline. This total reliance on a single overland bottleneck was a massive strategic vulnerability. The system broke in 1453. Ottoman forces captured Constantinople, the critical gateway between East and West. This map shows the immediate consequence. By seizing the city, the Ottomans effectively severed the land route, creating a total blockade for European merchants. The supply of Eastern goods stopped overnight. As the new Ottoman monopoly took hold, the price of existing spice stocks in Europe skyrocketed. The blockade created a massive economic vacuum. The first nation to map a physical bypass around the land route would secure an exclusive pipeline of wealth. Portugal pivoted to the Atlantic. The effort was led by Prince Henry the Navigator. Henry operated as a state-sponsored financier, funding a national research and development initiative focused on ship design, cartography, and navigational mathematics. This antique map reveals the scale of the challenge. At the time, no European knew the true shape of the African continent, or if it was even possible to navigate around it. The breakthrough came when Bartholomew Diaz navigated his fleet down the western coast and finally rounded the southern tip of Africa. Diaz proved the ocean route was a physical reality. The project moved from a geographical myth to a solvable engineering problem. In 1498, Vasco da Gama successfully navigated his fleet around the African continent and made landfall on the coast of India. But reaching the destination was only the first step. Portugal now faced a logistical crisis. How could a tiny nation with a limited population maintain control over a trade route located thousands of miles away? The first viceroy of Portuguese India, Francisco de Almeida, proposed a solution in these notes: the Blue Water Policy. Portugal would avoid Asian land wars, focusing its military entirely on the sea to control shipping lanes and build fortresses at key coastal choke points. Alfonso de Albuquerque took command next, weaponizing this policy to seize those strategic choke points and secure the eastern trade. By concentrating their power on the water, the Portuguese established a new form of empire, one based on the control of trade routes rather than the conquest of territory. Portugal's monopoly was temporary. Once da Gama's navigational route was documented, it became a replicable blueprint for any nation with a fleet. Rival European nations quickly organized into corporate entities, pooling capital to claim their own share of the Indian market. This timeline charts the resulting cascade. The Dutch arrived in 1596, followed by the English East India Company in 1600. The Danish followed in 1616, and the French arrived in 1664. These archival notes log that exact sequence, cataloging the 5 major European powers as they established competing footholds in India. Da Gama's single voyage triggered an unstoppable avalanche. The Indian Ocean was transformed from a regional trade zone into a global corporate battlefield. The footholds established in 1498 locked in a continuous European presence that would dictate the political fate of the subcontinent until the mid-20th century. The historical sequence was a direct chain reaction. A single local blockade caused 450 years of global colonization. When those first ships left Portugal, the goal was simple: to buy spices at a lower price. But that search for a trade bypass inadvertently drew the economic and political borders of the modern world. This map shows the economic arteries of the 15th century world. Global wealth at the time relied on a continuous overland flow of spices, silk, and textiles, traveling thousands of miles from the Indian subcontinent directly into Western Europe. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire captured the city of Constantinople. Looking at the map, you can see how this single military victory severed the primary bridge between East and West. European merchants relying on those routes immediately faced staggering transit taxes. The flow of goods hit a physical and financial wall, creating a massive supply shortage across the continent. Facing economic strangulation, European powers needed a workaround. The only option left was to attempt an ocean crossing that had never been successfully completed, bypassing the landmass entirely to find a direct sea route to India. A regional siege in modern-day Turkey forced an entire continent to look outward, initiating a desperate race to map the world's oceans. 45 years later, Portugal solved the navigation problem. In 1498, explorer Vasco da Gama survived the brutal ocean currents rounding the southern tip of Africa, successfully piloting his fleet all the way to Calicut on the southwestern coast of India. The Portuguese crown moved to secure an absolute trade monopoly. By locking out all other European competitors at the source, they intended to control the price of every shipment of spice entering the European market. To execute this, their first viceroy, Francisco de Almeida, implemented the Blue Water Policy. The Blue Water Policy is a naval strategy that prioritizes heavily armed fleets controlling open ocean routes, rather than attempting to conquer and hold vast stretches of inland territory. Following that doctrine, his successor, Alfonso de Albuquerque, captured the island of Goa in 1510. By replacing temporary trading posts with heavily fortified permanent stone settlements, Portugal created an impenetrable naval base right on India's doorstep. By securing maritime choke points instead of marching inland, Portugal wrote the exact operational manual for overseas empire building that rival nations would spend the next 3 centuries copying. The sudden massive influx of wealth pouring into Lisbon triggered immediate alarm in rival European capitals. Every other major power realized they needed their own coastal footholds to survive the shifting economy. This handwritten document records the timeline of European arrivals in the region. The Dutch were the first to follow Portugal's lead, arriving in 1596 and quickly setting up a base of operations in Pulicat. 4 years later, in 1600, the English entered the arena, eventually targeting Calcutta. They built up immense commercial infrastructure, turning a coastal settlement into a dense, sprawling economic hub. The Danes arrived next in 1616, staking their own claim in Serampore. Finally, the French crown chartered its own East India Company, reaching the subcontinent in 1664 and claiming the southeastern enclave of Pondicherry. This map shows the resulting distribution of power along the Indian subcontinent's coastline. Within a few decades, what were once independent local ports were aggressively converted into a highly militarized network of competing European outposts. Local rulers were pressured into exclusive treaties, and European conflicts routinely spilled over into Indian waters. The coastline became a heavily armed staging ground for distant empires fighting over global market share. This map of Hindustan shows the eventual outcome of that arms race, outlining the vast territorial span of British possessions. Through centuries of aggressive expansion and local exploitation, the British outmaneuvered their European rivals and swallowed nearly the entire subcontinent. That period of absolute British dominance lasted until 1947. After decades of resistance, India reclaimed its independence, forcing the British to formally transfer power and exit the country. Yet, if you look closely at the timelines of European occupation, a surprising detail emerges. While the British controlled the vast majority of the landmass, they weren't the last to leave. The Portuguese remained firmly entrenched in Goa. The very first maritime explorers to drop anchor in 1498 held on to their stone fortresses through the entire rise and fall of the British Empire. Portugal maintained its grip on Goa until 1961, 14 years after Indian independence. The 1453 blockade triggered a desperate search for a maritime bypass. That detour didn't just remap trade, it established the specific network of fortified coastal enclaves that would facilitate European colonial rule in India for the next 400 years.
ಇನ್ನೂ ಈ ತರಹ ಹೆಚ್ಚು ವಿಡಿಯೋಗಾಗಿ ನಮ್ಮ ಚಾನೆಲ್ ಸಬ್ಸ್ಕ್ರೈಬ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. ಹಾಗೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಅನಿಸಿಕೆನ ಕೆಳಗಡೆ ಕಮೆಂಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ.
ಹೌದು.
ಸಿಗೋಣ ಮುಂದಿನ ವಿಡಿಯೋದಲ್ಲಿ. ನಮಸ್ಕಾರ.